Welcome, everyone. Today, we are exploring technology-facilitated gender-based violence, or TFGBV, in Africa, how AI systems interact with societal harms, and how we can learn to design more human rights-aligned technologies. And so this case study is part of the African AI and Equality Toolbox, developed in collaboration with Women at the Table and the African Center for Technology Studies. And as we've mentioned in the previous webinars, the toolbox is really designed to help policymakers, tech practitioners, and communities build inclusive and rights-respecting AI systems. And what the toolbox does is really map the 6 stages of the AI lifecycle, from design through development, through deployment and monitoring, providing reflection questions, assessment tools, and African case studies in each stage. And so today our focus is stage 3, data discovery and preparation, which is really where bias often enters AI systems invisibly and where the exclusion of African voices has devastating consequences for TFGBV detection. So today we'll examine how data gaps blind AI systems to African realities and really look at how this research is now powering collaborative efforts to shift technical capacity directly into the hands of frontline feminists. And I'm really honored that our guest today is Athandiwe Saba, who's the AI Newsroom Initiative Lead and who's the Managing Editor at Code for Africa's iLAB team. She leads research on TFGBV across 11 countries, working with a team of investigative analysts to analyze harassment patterns and AI amplification. So this research has been ongoing since 2023, and it examines how technology becomes weaponized against women and LGBTQ communities across the continent and what we can do about it. And Athandiwe's team has contributed with a case study to the African AI and Equality Toolbox. So welcome, Athandiwe. And
thank you so much, Amina.
Thank you for being here. I wanted to kind of do slightly of a deep dive into before we dive into the data, really to establish what we mean by TFGBV and why the African context matter. And so just in terms of definition, technology-facilitated gender-based violence is the use of digital technologies to perpetrate, amplify, or coordinate violence and harassment, targeting individuals based on their gender, sexual orientation, or gender identity, which includes coordinated harassment campaigns, AI-generated deepfakes, doxing, reputation destruction, image-based abuse, and coded threats, which often appear as cultural slurs that evade automated detection. And the context of this conversation and why we're excited to hear from Athandiwe is that the African context demands special attention in the sense that African women and LGBTQ individuals and communities face compound vulnerabilities because they face pre-existing gender-based violence in physical spaces, also legal frameworks that criminalize LGBTQ plus identities in many countries, limited access to justice and protection mechanism, and platforms really designed elsewhere that are optimized for other contexts. So we also take it that TFGBV isn't just digital harassment, it's a tool of political suppression, democratic erosion, and also systematic inclusion. So over to you, Athandiwe. I'd really like to hear from you about the research. You've spent years documenting campaigns across 11 countries. So when you explain TFGBV to people who are probably unfamiliar with it, what do you want them to understand about how it manifests, and in Africa especially?
So thank you so much, Amina, and thank you for actually getting us on this particular platform to talk about technology facilitated gender-based violence. I think in the African context, yes, there's a big issue because of how the algorithms and how the large language models are fed. But we'll get into that. But I think generally, GBV is a huge problem within the global South countries, which are inclusive of your India, your Indonesia, your African countries as well, South Africa, where I'm currently based. So, of course, in the past couple of years, we've been seeing a lot of what we usually attribute to offline situations or situational incidents are germinating online. A lot of how women are addressed are offline, is being seen and is being hyped up a lot more on the online space. So the team that I work with, the iLAB, which is one of several directorates within Code for Africa, has consistently focused on amplified, manipulated information online. And so our research into technology facilitated GBV was only part of the work that we were doing. However, as we were investigating a lot of the manipulated information online, we started seeing pointed attacks at women. Started seeing them from a political kind of lens, where we would see internal manipulated information in specifically, let's say, within a Kenya context, where political leaders would women political leaders would be targeted. And that's a lot of the stuff that we usually see offline, and now we're seeing that happening online. And it would possibly come up a lot of the time. It started coming up as just simply part of the investigative work we would do, where things were being amplified or algorithms were pushing particular content, or particular bad actors were amplifying specific kind of content. And we started picking up a lot of that kind of content. And then, of course, then we wanted to see if this was only particular in specific countries. And I mentioned Kenya because Kenya is one of the countries that we've been looking into in terms of manipulated information online. And when I talk about manipulated information, I think a lot of people think, and rightfully so, think of disinformation. And that's just to make uh, um, our viewers and our listeners a little bit more comfortable. Disinformation, it's misinformation. It's where people take lies and truths and mix them up to confuse the audience that's out there on particular topics. Women, on the other hand, so we've been researching quite a lot of that. Right now we are in about 27 different African countries. TFGBV started becoming more and more focal and started coming up more and more often, where women were centered. And we started then seeing it in other spaces as well, outside of the political spaces, where the slurs against women, whether they were artists or politicians or activists, particular accounts going after women and with derogatory terms. And it wasn't just women as well. It was how would I put it, a more general in terms of what people who identify as women as well. So we would move into the LGBTQI plus space as well, people who identify differently. And it people who identify as women, but also women who identify as any other gender, they would be attacked with slurs, with doxing, with harassment, with and a lot of the actors that would do that would come up on several occasions, or within against several women, or within several narratives or campaigns against women across different countries as well. So when we started seeing this, then we felt that we needed to actually start put actually a particular lens. And the word TFGBV had already started to come up, but we were actually seeing it from an African context and how that was affecting leaders within the political space, women within the media space, journalists were no longer, they didn't feel comfortable with on particular platforms to talk about the investigative work or the stories that they were writing. And there was this consistent uh, barrage at getting women to be silenced on those particular platforms. And that's how we started actually monitoring and looking into examples of TFGBV across the several countries, as you have mentioned.
Thank you so much. And I'm really curious, which I think you've already touched on, is perhaps what surprised you most, which seems to be quite of an organized kind of platforms, and how, these attacks are very much synchronized and really gearing to attack particular groups. And I want to combine, I guess, this curiosity with perhaps, what is the human impacts of technology facilitated gender-based violence, and what happens to women in as we leave the virtual world into everyday life.
Mm. I think first part, what surprised me the most when we started looking into this, and then I'll get to the second part about the actual ramifications of this, and we've seen them actually happening offline as well. So the first part, what shocked me the most is that platforms which I remember when I started being a journalist, everyone was like, you have to be on Facebook, you have to be on X, Twitter at that time. You have to be on X, you have to be on Facebook because that's how you build your brand and this and that. And at that point, we had thought that these platforms were safe platforms for us to have opinions as women or as journalists or as anybody actually, that we safe platforms we could actually have opinions, and it could be a space where people could converse and have different ideas about things. Of course, we've seen that in the past 5 to about 10 years, we've seen that that is not what these platforms, and it's gotten worse, of course, in the past 2 to 3 years or so. But within that period, we did believe that it was a space for that for open conversation. What surprised me now is that some of the add-ons on these platforms actually, and the algorithms, understanding and learning about algorithms, was first the new bells and whistles, if I can put it that way, on some of these platforms were actually conducive to target women. One of the platforms that we investigated was TikTok. And TikTok is a great space where young people and women and everyone can post videos, and I can see what's happening in the rural areas and how people, it's such an engaging, because video is such an engaging space. But some of the add-ons on TikTok, which would be like your on-demand kind of video, your virtuals, when those videos would go on, women would be targeted and told to take off their clothes. If they don't take off their clothes, they would be harassed with the fact that they would be doxxed, or they would be this big reporting on all the different accounts. All these male run accounts would report this one woman's account to TikTok so that her account would be shut down. So there are those kinds of threats that you're finding, and these women then feel that they have to, because they still want the followers so that they could make money off at the end of the day. But the whole concept of a TikTok live was not for that. That, for me, seeing how that could be easily abused by these bad actors and some of these accounts that are harassing women online, was quite interesting, because then you would think things like Grok. We took quite a deep dive into Grok and how Grok was used to undress women. A new tool on this particular platform. So nobody is designing the tools and the add-ons to their tools from the premise of protecting women, from the premise of protecting young girls and girls generally. No one is designing from that premise. And that for me was a big shock. It's always a design. I've always felt that if tools, and especially within this big AI drive, and everybody is talking about it, but if the tools are not designed for the most disadvantaged, and that goes beyond women and children and the LGBTQI community to people who are differently abled. If these tools are not designed from the premise of supporting those communities, we are going to find ourselves with TikTok lives that are directly targeting women and harassing them. And what happened with Grok, when men could easily just tell Grok to undress any woman, and those images could easily be trending everywhere, because those platforms and those add-ons and those tools are not designed from the basis of um, uh, um, basic human rights and from the basis of protecting disadvantaged groups, which are disadvantaged offline, and then we find them disadvantaged online. So for me, that came as and that understanding of the creation of these platforms and understanding that was quite a big shock for me to see it actually playing itself out. And then I think on the aspect of what then happens, what are the ramifications? Of course, we saw the ramifications with what happened with Grok, where women's images of them, and I'm putting it in inverted commas, being naked on social media platforms. Some women were religiously inclined, and there their images are. What then does that do to women? What does that do to anybody who has their images posted online being undressed? So it has direct ramifications offline for women and how they are perceived, how they are judged, they how they walk into their workspaces going forward as well. That has a detrimental effect on them, and it's got nothing to do with what they did or what they didn't do online. If those tools and those add-ons to those particular platforms are not designed with basic human rights understanding and designed to protect humans from such predators online, there are direct ramifications. And then, of course, you have women who no longer want to converse on these platforms, and therefore these platforms become redundant. But also, you also have these echo chambers of men who feel that their voices are so strong online that they would be offline as well, and not understanding human interaction anymore. Young boys growing up with this vision of, well, if I believe that I can do this to women, I can do that offline as well. So you are creating a repetitive cycle of abuse from men on women on a different kind of on a different kind of platform, but that then goes offline as well, and therefore perpetuating the cycle that we've been working so hard and trying so hard to break on gender-based violence anywhere offline. The online space is just breeding that ground for men and young boys to try it offline as well.
It's such an incredible and profound social analysis that you've given, but also going beyond the social analysis, the actual technicalities of what that looks like. And part of today's webinar and the theme is also like thinking about the AI lifecycle. What does it mean to think about tools that are built with human dignity in mind, as you've just explained? And so the stage is on data discovery and preparation, which I think the toolbox likes to think about it as the foundation where really AI systems either learn to recognize harm or really become complicit in amplifying it. And in this stage, developers sort of have to identify and collect training data for AI models. They have to assess whether the data represents the context where the systems will be used, pre-process data to address gaps, biases, and they also determine if consent was obtained, to evaluate cultural and demographic representativeness. And the question of what is happening online brings the thematic of content moderation. Who is actually moderating in these platforms if there is no automation of harm detection? And so also we know that, yeah, content moderation systems are only as good as their training data, and that most of the content moderation AI currently deployed is mainly trained on English language data sets from North America and Europe, that it use user-generated content that overrepresents Western cultural contexts, also that speech taxonomies don't really include African languages or slurs, and that harassment patterns also don't reflect coordinated campaigns that are common in global South contexts, and eventually which results really in systematic blindness. So Athandiwe, I would love for you to make this concrete based on the research that you've conducted. So we understand from the case study that content moderation models trained primarily on Western data sets fail dramatically when they're deployed on the continent. And could you please walk us through what this actually, looks like?
This is, I think this is the easier question, because conversations are happening online. They're not happening in English. They're not happening in French. A lot of the bad actors that we are finding, they easily are able to circumvent the moderation guidelines or rules of a lot of these different platforms. For instance, when we are talking about a TikTok live that we were able to get into, the conversation is happening in Swahili, or the conversation is happening in Bambara. The content moderation is focused on looking at it in English or French, or Spanish, whichever other one of the languages that are spoken mostly in the global north. None of those are able to pick this up. Where they are able to pick up, the bad actors, or the people amplifying this kind of stuff against women, are also changing the tact, where instead of using an A for Apple, they use the at sign. Moderation is not being able to pick that up. Or they use hearts, or they use hashtags. All of that is to circumvent a lot of the moderation guidelines that are out there. And not to say that, well, the big tech is not being able to some of these platforms are not being able to pick up. They are trying to do that. However, the data that they are training their automation and to pick up some of these issues is not still not inclusive a lot of languages in the global south. As I mentioned, in Mali, some of the stuff that we were able to pick up is happening in languages that we are even battling to figure out how to pick up some of those conversations. You go to Cameroon, where the current president's daughter was hounded and harassed about her sexuality and so forth. A lot of the conversation is happening in languages that are not being able to detect. A lot of the work that my team does, we how my team is kind of built up is to try and have as many in-country experts as possible. In Cote d'Ivoire, for instance, and in Senegal, we're trying to find people who are able to speak Wolof, who will then be part of our team, because we understand that if we don't understand Wolof, which is one of the highly spoken languages in Senegal, we will not be able to figure out what the conversations are there. So there are the moderation and detection guidelines, but without training the algorithms, without training the detection models with the languages, and possibly the platforms feel like this is a cost that they're not willing to carry, but they're very happy to carry a lot of the African content. They're very happy to carry a lot of the African writers and so forth, but they're not happy to carry the cost that it comes with actually finding the languages and using that languages to train the particular data. And this goes to X, exactly the same kind of circumvention of the conversations and the guidelines, easily circumvented on X. When Grok was asked to undress women, that was not even picked up. That Grok did that for at least a couple of days before that was picked up. And even when it was picked up, what are they doing with the content that was already on those particular platforms? How are they finding it? How are they removing it? There's a gentleman from I think it is X platform, and he works for no Facebook, actually Facebook Meta, in South Africa, and he was telling us, well, we have like 1,000 of these images that are popping up online. We take 1,000 down, and 2,000 come up more. If they are able to build some of the algorithms that they have built, the question is, why are they not focusing on ensuring that when something has been found, automatically you are not even allowed to post something? So they're always telling us that oh no, they're behind because people are consistently creating new ways to circumvent their guidelines and so forth. But these are big tech companies that are making so much money off of the data that people are putting onto those platforms, but they are consistently informing us that they are behind, that they are lagging, that they are figuring things out. It is one of the biggest issues is specifically language, is specifically the use of these emojis and the use of different ways to write keywords. The big platforms know that. There's people who use that to circumvent the guidelines, know that, but they aren't real solutions. So languages language is such a big thing, and the way that people actually write things on different platforms is so important. I think there should be a lot more energy put to that instead of trying to moderate languages that are not used or of importance as important in the global south as they are in the global north.
I want to go back to the example of Brenda Bia's case in Cameroon, where your team has identified 34 identical harassment posts that appeared simultaneously, and I think you responded very much to the question of why do platforms miss these kind of campaigns and harassment. Is there something particular about this Brenda Bia case?
Oh, definitely. This was a coordinated messaging, and it happened on Facebook mostly. And there were lots of sexualized insults against her. And people wanted to make it seem like it was just like sarcastic, and it's just, we were just mocking her. It's got nothing to do really with anything deep, but it was TFGBV. We found beyond the accounts that you mentioned on TikTok, we found 92 Facebook posts that consistently said, look at her before and after, and jokes that were laughing emojis, ridiculing her. These Facebook posts saw about close to 10 million views. 10 million views harassing a woman on on Facebook. Only on Facebook. Those are the 10 million views only on Facebook. There were others on TikTok. There were others on X platforms. But just on Facebook, 10 million views. And then Facebook could easily turn around and say, oh, we tried to remove them. We didn't see anything wrong with it. Anything wrong with it, because that's also another conversation about what do these platforms see as a TFGBV, or if it's not TFGBV. And I think in this particular climate of kind of the relationship between the US and big tech companies and these particular platforms is very challenging at this point in time for women across the board, not even just from the global south, because there's this idea that harassing women online is just freedom of speech. It's just, people can say that she looks ugly, but it has a sexualized tone to it, and it's stuff that I think when I work a lot with my team, the iLAB team, and we're looking at these kinds of cases, there is that question of, is it freedom of speech? Is it people who can say some so and so is ugly and so is not ugly, and let's compare their faces? So we have these conversations because of the geopolitical shift there has been. Instead of protecting people, now we want to see if, well, are we protecting their freedom of speech? And that becomes quite a big issue as well, because yes, the Bia case had close over 10 million views on Facebook, but they could easily turn around and say, well, that was freedom of speech. But it is not. It is consistent harassment of a human being. That particular harassment would not be acceptable offline. Why are we accepting it online? Because if 10 million people came and pointed at her and said stuff and stood outside her house or stood outside her flat or wherever she is and were hounding her and laughing at her and pointing fingers, that would be seen as harassment and those people would be arrested. Yet or online, it seems like it's a very different kind of environment. That should not be the case. So the Bia case, as much as there is criticism around her father's role within Cameroon, which is acceptable because of the democratic principles that are thwarted in that particular country, that is acceptable. However, going for a human being, and it should be clear cut. There should be no kind of conversation about it, whether it's politically inclined or not, and if it's fair and if it's not fair. The kind of harassment that person faced during that time is not something that would be accepted on any particular platform offline.
100%. And thinking here about prevention mechanisms, futures, more equitable online and safer online futures, the question of consent comes through or comes in. So the toolbox really emphasizes that, data collection is never neutral. It reflects power and, of course, the voices that have been included. And your research also reveals that training data sets for content moderation include harassment content that has targeted women and LGBTQ plus communities without their consent. And really, really would like you to explain this problem.
So consent is quite a big issue. And I think for the marginalized groups that women like me and yourself are in, especially in the global south and in the global north, consent is never, I don't think consent is ever a, with the building of some of these tools and AI, consent is never forefront. It I think a lot of platforms, with some of the research that we're seeing that a lot of these platforms are assuming that this is what particular groups or marginalized groups, this is what their view would be on whether or how to protect them online. So when we are thinking about artificial intelligence, and it goes back to my premise that it these large a lot of these platforms are not built from the perspective of protection or from the perspective or on the basis of human rights and protection rights. If they were, consent would not even be an issue we'd need to talk about. It would be duly already incorporated in how are we engaging with the particular platform. If you're finding a lot of the AI or large language model training, you have to opt out. And if you don't know, you don't even know that you need to opt out. So therefore, automatically, you've opted in. But if it was based off of the premise of human rights, you would have to opt in to provide that particular information. A ripe example right now, one of the platforms that I think a lot of people still feel comfortable in using would be LinkedIn. LinkedIn had an opt out on whether it can use your data, whether you're woman, man, your data on a training its a company's large language models. You have to opt out. If any tools are being built for real, on the basis of real human rights, you will have to opt in and not have to be asked. And a lot of these buttons of opting in and opting out, they never you most people don't actually really know whether they're there, whether they're not, and how many people are actually thinking, okay, if I go onto this website, I need to actually think, oh, should I be opting in or should I be opting out? What and where do you find it? And they're always obscure as well. So the issue of privacy and the issue of using my training data as a Black African woman it does not play into the considerations of a lot of these large language models or big tech or a lot of these social media platforms. We know Facebook was just out there using our data. None of this was ever a conversation point. Facebook came out and it already had a Grok, Facebook, a lot of these other platforms already had all of our data and had already trained a lot of the algorithms off of our data without asking. And so that has happened for so long because the tech world is so not governed. And I think a lot of people are just looking at the EU's act right now and hoping that that could be one of the ways that, but in terms of a global south perspective, does that even encompass any of the issues that we're currently dealing with? The Global South and EU's issues on platform integrity and platform use and data integrity is vastly different, extremely different. But everybody's just waiting on the EU, hoping that they will do something and regulate big tech. Big tech has not been regulated. And if we're not taking that step forward, we're going to see a lot more of the online harassment that we have seen because of the kinds of training data. If they can't train the algorithms and train their large language models off of our data without us having actually consented to that, then how much more so will we see the kind of harassment that we're seeing on social media platforms, because the premise and the foundations of those tools and big tech and those platforms, the premise was never about protecting us. The premise was never about making sure that it is based on basic human rights.
If we could rebuild these systems from the ground up, what would human rights aligned data practices look like for TFGBV prevention in Africa?
I think it would not even necessarily be around focusing necessarily just on TFGBV. I think it would have to be a broader understanding of building for disadvantaged communities and or previously left behind communities, however, whichever term currently is in vogue. But it is the communities that have been discriminated against offline and therefore now online. And if those communities, if we can begin and think around creating for those communities, I think then we would have a less of an issue in terms of having to deal with the particular issues that we're currently dealing with. So if we can build from the understanding of the disadvantage, all of the tools would serve everyone. They would not just be focused on serving the minority or particular people. They would be able to serve everyone without us even having to fight for that particular space. Um, Once I started understanding quite the feminist kind of perspective on building tools, I started seeing things very differently. I started looking at ramps. You know, there was that big issue for differently abled people and whether every place should have a ramp, or what's wrong with stairs? Differently abled people can figure themselves out. Or why should we build ramps instead of steps? But if you look at how ramps are worth everybody using them, if you're using a particular cane on the day that you have sprained your ankle, you can use that ramp. You're not necessarily just differently abled. If you are trying to transport heavy goods, you can use that ramp, the steps. So once you start thinking that if I create for everyone all the time, you never have to have the conversations about perfectly abled people who at times no longer can use those steps and therefore use the ramp. So it's so important, I think, when we are looking into the future, we're looking to designing things, building new tools, building new platforms and new spaces on the digital platforms, to think, who are we designing for? Are we designing for myself, perfectly abled, but disadvantaged in some form? Or are we designing for everyone? Everyone who could possibly want to use this platform. If we start from that particular premise, we start designing differently and we start designing for everyone.
So much, Athandiwe, and actually, as you've said, it also requires a fundamental shift from extractive data to genuine, actually, practices of co-creation. And I think that's exactly what your research has made possible, your team's research, and kind of laying the groundwork for evidence. Because what you gathered hasn't just been about documenting the problem, but also creating the foundation for a different approach, for a feminist approach, one which, as African feminists or other groups on the continent, other individuals aren't necessarily or wouldn't necessarily wait for Silicon Valley to solve their problems, but can build their own sort of countermeasures. I was wondering if we could do a final kind of deep dive on one of the case studies. As you've analyzed social media data across 11 countries to identify TFGBV campaigns, which also included deepfakes targeting Ethiopia's mayor Adenech Abiyebi, and coordinated harassment of Brenda Bia in Cameroon, you uncovered both the scale and sophistication of these attacks. And the deepfake attack on Ethiopia's mayor is also particularly chilling. If you could tell us what happened and what does it tell us about AI's role in also political violence against women?
AI generated images, AI generated audio, AI generated videos is becoming one of our biggest issues across the disinformation landscape, across the manipulated information landscape, from politics and definitely within the space of TFGBV as well. So the case that you're talking about kind of was we picked it up a little while ago. I think it was about Just trying to remember, probably quite earlier this year, if I'm not mistaken. And what we saw was TikTok users targeting Adenech Abibi, who is Addis Ababa's mayor. And what they were doing is they were creating AI generated videos. And of course, some of these were quite sloppy, but they're becoming more and more sophisticated. And these AI generated videos were linking her to the Ethiopian prime minister and also an Equatorial Guinea diplomat in a sexualized way. The Equatorial Guinea diplomat was in the news quite a bit about his sexual relations with several people. And now these AI generated videos were connecting her to him. This is all, of course, this is all harassment, of course, and it's also to harm her reputation. And it goes back to that part that I was making, that we're seeing a lot of harm against women who dare to stand in what some people term as male roles, like being mayors, like wanting to stand for presidencies. And they were insinuating that this woman's career is only based solely, and her success is only based solely on her sexual favors with the prime minister and other particular diplomats. And the videos were her of kissing the prime minister, holding hands with these particular diplomats, and they are, even though they are not a critical eye can easily see that these were AI generated videos, but ordinary people who are not as critical, the ordinary people who are expected to go and vote for her to be in that position, the ordinary people who are going to call in on radio shows and talk about how promiscuous she is and how they wouldn't want a promiscuous woman mayor in that particular position. They don't have that particular critical eye. You and me can easily see from those videos that this is AI generated and it's easily out there to harm her reputation. But we're finding that a lot of the stuff, some people actually believe it, and therefore they share it, and it perpetuates the harm against this particular woman. So this wasn't only just her. There was also a Nigerian senator, Natasha Akpoti, and she faced also a smear campaign with the claims that she was blackmailing the Senate president. And actually, instead of her saying that she had actually been harassed um, by this particular Senate, they were saying that she was the one who was bringing unfounded allegations against him. And there were AI generated videos of the two of them to kind of downplay that she was saying that he has harassed her. And her case was actually thrown out. From Parliament. Her case was thrown out and it was not heard because of this onslaught that said, no, 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 they actually have a sexual relationship together. Look, they actually have been together. They've been photographed together. This is all AI generated content. It has offline ramifications on the reputation of these women and how they are respected, or the lack of respect when they are walking within the roles that they are in. So the AI generated content that can easily be created like this. And look, there are currently conversations around how to AI generated content should be marked. But how far, if in Africa, in the global south, we're still dealing with issues of training data on languages that people are actually using to push manipulated information, and that can't be picked up by these platforms. How further along are we going to be in terms of actually marking AI generated content where people are creating such images? We haven't even gotten to a place where we can actually properly moderate information around women. How far along will we be if we now say no? These AI tools should actually state that this video was created by an AI tool. I don't see that happening without a consistent and enforceable framework of using AI in Africa. And it is becoming more and more of a problem. And we're hearing audio as well now that is really, really good. That is really good. And without that critical eye, you would believe that that audio is real. And it actually is there to impact non-critical users, people, and this is the majority of the voting populace or the majority of human beings who are going to go out and perpetuate this stuff offline without actually critically thinking that, whoa, hang ten, this is this actually real? Should I be asking more questions about this content that I'm sharing online, that I'm sending out to other WhatsApp groups, or that I believe that this particular mayor, my mayor in Addis Ababa, my mayor is actually doing this? Or should I actually be asking the critical questions? And a lot of these people, they don't. And you find this stuff spreading so quickly and so easily across the online platforms.
Thanks so much for that, Athandiwe. I really love what you said. TFGBV isn't just about content moderation, and it's not a content moderation problem because it operates like organized crime, coordinated networks, systematic evasion tactics, infrastructure that really enables it and also enables people to profit from it, which also demands a different type of response. So not just better filters, but also forensic countermeasures. And that's exactly, I guess, what we're hoping to develop together as part of the A+ Alliance, which is a coalition between Code for Africa and Women at the Table. And as a last question, Athandiwe, I would really love to hear from you about what it means to move from documenting harm to feminist and women's rights groups having the technical tools to disrupt it themselves.
It means having a voice. If we are no longer waiting on big tech to create for us, if we're no longer waiting for these platforms to include us, it's building our own table. It's building our own seats at this table. It's making sure that we actually have a voice, because what is currently happening across the board, especially for women in the global south and specifically in Africa as well, we are being completely excluded from the conversations that then begin. Those conversations lead to guidelines that are being created and frameworks that actually big tech and these big AI platforms are being built on. And if those conversations are not including you and me right now, trust me, those tools and those platforms will not include our perspective, our lived experiences. No one will care what a woman is supposed to look like, what should be the equality principles that include Black women or women in the global South generally within these conversations. So us building, no matter how small. I think a lot of people think, oh, if I want to build in the language space or in the natural language space, I need to build large language models. That's not true. You can build small language models that are quite focused on your particular community, and there's so much written text in the many different languages that we speak. In South Africa alone, there's 11 official languages. In Nigeria, there's 60 to 100. I'm not sure. There's so many languages, but those languages carry so much about who we are as women in the global south. They talk about our struggles. They talk about how we engage with not just technology, our homes, our workspaces, what our troubles are, what our traumas are, what our happiness is, what our joy looks like, what our problem solving solutions, what our solutions actually look like. They're not the same as anybody else, as the global north. But in those languages and in that written text and in those small language models that we want to create and in those tools that we want to build as women, that's where we find our voice. I'm a super user of artificial intelligence, from the generative part of it to the tools part of it to the solutions part of it. So at no point in time will I ever tell people it's all evil. I think it is a tool that we can use to bring our voice where actual people, human beings, are trying to erase it, trying to erase our experiences. Because when I say people, these large language models, these big tech, these tools, these platforms, they are built by humans who think in a particular way. And we should never think that these tools are just automatically there. They're built by humans who don't look like us. And for us to have an impact on those conversations, on how these tools come up with solutions, assist us in coming up with solutions to the dire problems of the global south, we have to be part of that building. They're not going to do it for us. We need to be the people who are building the different tables and who are forcing ourselves into those particular conversations.
Thank you so much, Athandiwe, for such an amazing reflection and response, and also for the powerful research that you have been conducting with your iLAB team at Code for Africa, and for the work ahead. So, to everyone watching, I think the evidence is clear. The path forward is mapped, and we are trying to support building those tools, and we hope that the power is shifting. So if you're a policymaker, please use the toolbox to center human rights in AI governance, in how you think about how AI should be built. And if you're a developer, please audit your training data and partner with the communities that are impacted or affected, regardless of where you are. I think the Africa Toolbox really provide an example for the world to understand what it means to center human rights at its core. And if you're a feminist organization, please connect with the work that we're doing at A Plus Alliance. And thank you so much, Athandiwe. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for your time. I really, really appreciate it. It's been wonderful listening and being in conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Amina. And thank you to everyone who is engaging and continues to make use of the tools as well. Such important work.